Hey, welcome back to a dispatch from Holly McKay. Today we're going to be talking about adoption, and in particular, adoption of older children. Holly's been looking into this a little bit. So, Holly, go ahead. Tell us what have you been finding on this?
Well, I think this is a really interesting issue, and it's something you hear a lot about in the United States, and I'm sure all of us have friends or even family members that have been adopted, but it's sort of a very convoluted process. And so recently, I had the opportunity to sit down with Randi Thompson. And she runs a nonprofit organization called Kidsave International. And Kidsave works both in the United States and in a lot of foreign countries. For example, they're doing a lot of work in Ukraine at the moment. Ukraine sort of has many orphanages. And of course, when the war started, it became very unsafe and very difficult for a lot of the orphans to stay there. So it is quite a challenge. But what I really wanted to sort of talk to Randy about was adoption in the US. And one thing that KidSave does focus on is older adoption. And when we think about adoption, we tend to think of babies or very young children. And unfortunately, both the system, in the US and in other countries, once these children sort of reach a certain age, in some places they're kind of kicked out onto the street and left to fend for themselves. And it's certainly the older they become, typically the harder it is to find them families. So Randy and KidSave work is really about trying to place older children in the US with suitable families. And they have a lot of really wonderful initiatives like picnics that they do in different areas. And then it sort of just gives an opportunity for communities to kind of meet some of these children and interact with them and to sort of see that they're more than just a rap sheet on paper. And of course, when you're a child and you've been going in and out of the foster system, generally speaking, a lot of them do unfortunately rack up some things that don't look so great on paper. And that's really just, I think, a byproduct of having such a difficult life. And I think when they find those right families, it's a really beautiful thing. And I think something that tends to get really overlooked in the US.
Yeah, well, it certainly does. I mean, you hear these stories about how difficult it is once you get past a certain age, because the statistics don't look good, do they?
No, they don't. And it's often, I mean, can you imagine, having to move from place to place and often places of neglect? I mean, we've all heard a lot of horror stories with the foster system and and I guess it's that sort of sense. I mean, can only imagine as a child that sense of not really having a belonging and having that nurturing sort of parenting that so many of us were very fortunate to grow up with. And I think we just tend to forget the older children. And of course, when we say older children, and I did ask Randy this, it differs from country to country or even state to state. But in some places, it could be young as 4, that's considered old, or in the US, it's usually, 8 and above. But according to UNICEF, there are more than 120,000 children in the US that are waiting to be adopted at any given moment. And then sort of 2 million children that are eligible for adoption globally. So there are so many children out there that really need these homes. And I think um, the process that we tend to look at in the US is often very convoluted. We tend to think of it as very expensive, but what Randy pointed out to me is when you are going through adoptions, it shouldn't cost you anything. There shouldn't be these sort of high fees that are attached to adoptions in the US. So there are so many sort of different misconceptions. And I think if you read the article, I really break a lot of those down. And I hope it gives a little bit more of a realistic sense of what the process is in the US.
Ah, very good. Yes, of course. And this organization is, when you talk to them, is it is it I mean, it's daunting enough in the US. How daunting is it overseas for the work that they do there?
Yeah, of course, it's incredibly daunting, but their objective is not necessarily to be placing Ukrainian children or Colombian children with Americans. They want these children to stay in their countries. They want these children to be raised by family members or other families in that country. So it's certainly not the goal to have them sort of taken abroad. That would be more considered to be sort of a last resort. But I know with Ukraine, they're currently setting up a sort of a much larger house that they hope will be kind of a little bit more. So you're not looking at sort of the term orphanages. We tend to have a lot of misconceptions about as well. So it's sort of more of a group home, I guess, where they can have people come and friends and family come to visit. And again, have these sort of weekend miracle programs and meet people from the community. And it's, I think, a much sort of more nourishing environment. So that's sort of something that Kidsave is working on in Ukraine. So that's sort of what we're seeing in, other countries. And I do think it's very important to highlight that it isn't always about trying to relocate them 5,000 miles away, to keep them in the home, in the language that they know and love. And I think that we also, when we think of overseas adoptions, because that also is a big focus here, I think groups like KidSave are really important in sort of being able to keep children close to home.
Oh, there you go. Okay, very good. Well, that's yeah, I mean, that's nice to see that they've got that aspect of things too. Well, very informative, Holly. I hope people that are listening to this get something out of it and look into this, because they're human beings who just it's a hard life enough as it is for them, and anything that can be done to alleviate that's always good. Thank you, Holly, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Dennis.